Welcome to the Fragility Forum 2022 podcast series produced by the Fragility, Conflict and Violence Group of the World Bank Group. As complexity and uncertainty become the new normal, with complex crises posing new challenges, from the COVID-19 pandemic to climate change, this podcast series explores how the international community can best support countries affected by fragility, conflict and violence in a fast-changing global landscape.
Hi, my name's Heather Marquette, and I'm Senior Research Fellow in the Research and Evidence Directorate at the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, or FCDO for short. I'm also a professor at the University of Birmingham and a steering committee member for the Global Thinking Working Politically Community of Practice. In this episode, we'll be speaking about an exciting research project that FCDO has commissioned, looking at how we can better understand the gap between the sorts of narrow elite bargains we find are most effective at helping to end violent conflict and the ambition to transition from these to more open and inclusive politics going forward. With me are the research team, Professor Sarah von Billerbeck and Professor Dominic Zaum, both from the University of Reading, and Alina Rota-Menakal from ODI in London. And my colleague, Tom Wheeler, who's head of the Analysis and Evidence team in the newly established Office for Conflict Stabilization and Mediation in FCDO, the team that funded this research. In this podcast, we'll look at where the demand for the research came from, what findings and lessons are emerging, and how the research may shape policy and practice for conflict and stabilization practitioners going forward. A quick business item before we start. For listeners who like to listen and tweet, please use the forum's hashtag, if at all possible, hashtag FragilityForum 2022. So we're going to kick off with Tom Wheeler to help us understand why FCDO was interested in commissioning this project on elite bargains. Before we do, it's worth understanding what the term actually means, especially given it has quite a long history. According to this project, elite bargains are, and I quote, discrete agreements or a series of agreements, often brokered and supported by international military, political, and economic interventions to end violence, that explicitly renegotiate the distribution of power and allocation of resources between elites. Sounds pretty simple, but it doesn't really tell us anything about what comes next, does it? So, Tom, starting at the beginning, why was this project commissioned?
Thanks, Heather. So the exact genesis for this project actually lies in how two related but distinct evidence and policy areas actually met one another. So on the one hand, the UK government had some fairly reliable evidence that suggests, over the long term, countries which are more inclusive and more open and more peaceful. And that evidence really shaped DFID's 2016 Building Stability Framework, which, as you know, had a big emphasis on inclusive political power structures and inclusive economic development. On the other hand, we also had a pretty good understanding of how many violent conflicts came to an end, which is through elite bargains. And the first elite bargains research project and some of the research others provided really came to evidence the updates in 2018 to the UK's approach to stabilization. Now, this updated framework importantly, flagged the need to think about and to prepare for the long term when we're delivering our short-term stabilization efforts. And it was actually working on that, actually in the middle of the drafting process of this new approach to stabilization, when we start to really pause and revisit this issue of transitions. I think we were able to set the overall direction, but we weren't quite satisfied because there was a few issues. So first, it was clear that, to begin with, there are trade-offs. So the bargain which may end violence may not be inclusive. So, for example, it might be characterized by some, very exclusionary elite capture. And those deals, in turn, might not only be anti-developmental, and so there's no real elite interest in development, but they might also not be able to manage the sort of social and economic changes or new grievances that come over time, and they might actually become sources of instability themselves. Second, we also knew that while open and inclusive societies were more peaceful in the long term, those periods of political transition are moments when countries are actually at the highest risk of instability. So even if an elite bargain might in principle be able to become more inclusive, the journey there could be one that is quite volatile. And then third, and finally, and probably most important for the UK, was we needed to think much more about how these transitions from closed elite deals to more open, inclusive settlements actually happen, and how external actors best support them. So when we looked at the sort of donor frameworks on stabilization or building stability, we sort of saw this temptation to say, well, just add the magic ingredient of inclusion here, without really spelling out how inclusion happens, and a way that's sort of cognizant of the real constraints on external influence. So look, while this wasn't a new challenge for HMG or for the wider policy community, we felt it was worth sort of go back and have another look at under sort of what circumstances and under what mechanisms you might see a more open and more inclusive political settlement emerge. And that is how we found ourselves here today.
Great, thank you so much, Tom. The ever elusive magic ingredient. I'm going to move over to the research team now. Dominic, have you found the magic ingredient? What is the research telling us about when and how elite bargains change?
Well, as always, there isn't a single silver bullet, but thanks, Heather. Elite bargains at their most basic change when elites change, and elites at their most basic change in two ways. The first way is when the interests of elites change. So if ruling elites seek a stronger rule of law, for example, because it enables better access to international markets, then this would increase the prospect for a more open and inclusive political order. And if we cannot understand and influence the interests of elites, it's now impossible to open up a narrow elite bargain. And of course, elites don't exist in a vacuum. They operate within a wider context. So the historical, economic, and institutional factors, to name just a few, that influence their interests and their behaviors is something we need to understand. The second way in which elite bargains change is when their membership changes, that is, who is part of such an elite bargain. For example, if new groups are included in an elite bargain, the benefits of this bargain, be they political or economic, will be distributed differently. Now, we need to remember ruling elites are rarely homogeneous, but normally coalitions of different groups with different interests and different preferences. So business leaders in an elite might have different preferences to military leaders. So the balance between different members in an elite coalition shapes the opportunities for changing an elite bargain. So how can such change happen? How do the interests or the membership of elites change? On the one hand, they can change in response to external or exogenous factors and shocks. So this could be sanctions, for example, or changes in external assistance, economic or military, for some groups. Think, for example, of the importance of Iranian assistance for Hezbollah to support its role in the Lebanese elite bargain over the last decades. On the other hand, though, interests and preferences are the results of the internal dynamics of elite bargains, and the change in these dynamics can change these interests. So as I said, most elite bargains are coalitions between different parties with different interests, and the balance between them, their influence on the nature of the bargain, isn't fixed. So over time, some groups might become more important, and with it, their interests are reflected more strongly in an elite bargain. Also, political and economic institutions can shape interests. They might either incentivize actors to behave differently. In ethnically divided contexts, for example, different electoral systems can either incentivize appealing to just one ethnic group or incentivize reaching out and appealing to a wider range of communities to maximize voter representation in legislature. Importantly, such internal dynamics have a much more gradual effect than external shocks, as elites adapt to changes in their environment, but over time these changes can be hugely significant. So if we look at those two, internal and external, we argue that the internal dynamics of an elite bargain is much more interesting and more important for our purposes. External shocks are inherently unpredictable. The levers for influencing and programming are much more limited. So any change in the external environment is also ultimately filtered through local political dynamics and structures. So understanding the internal dynamics of elite bargains is absolutely critical to supporting change.
Thanks a lot, Dominic. I mean, we hear a lot about these external shocks now, but not as much as you say about the internal dynamics. Alina, we actually hear a lot about people talking about context matters, which is really what those internal dynamics are about. Can you tell us more about these contextual dynamics, and particularly why you chose in the research to focus on three factors in particular: state capacity, the role of business actors, and questions of identity?
Yes, thank you so much, Heather. As both Tom and Dominic have emphasized, elite bargains do not exist in a vacuum. Rather, they are embedded within a set of institutional, political, economic, and social factors that shape and are in turn shaped by elite interests and preferences in an iterative manner. So we focused our research on state capacity, business actors, and identity because the interplay between these three factors is instrumental in framing prospects for more inclusive and open politics. And yet, this remains relatively unexplored, especially from a policy perspective. So in terms of state capacity, for example, research consistently shows that the state is indispensable in anchoring both more inclusive politics and more equitable developmental outcomes. But how a state evolves and functions and how it develops capacity and deploys it is profoundly linked to the nature of the underlying political settlement and the interests, incentives, orientation, and vision of the elites that constitute it. And again, this interaction between state capacity and elites is dynamic and both influence each other. Business actors also play an important role in shaping the nature of a given elite bargain and how it evolves over time. For one thing, they provide key sources of rents that are essential in enabling and sustaining elite bargains. But business actors are not homogeneous, and while they may be deeply linked to political elites, they may also be in a position to push for greater openness and inclusion if they see that this is in their interest. Finally, identity, especially in relation to ethnic, religious, and sectarian lines, defines the parameters of who is included and who is excluded from a given political system and a sense of common destiny, how and why. And so it plays an important role in shaping prospects for conflict and for more inclusive politics. This can be seen, for example, in the case of apartheid South Africa, in China in relation to the Uyghur population, and in Myanmar with respect to the Rohingya. And this shows that identity-based violence is a leading fault line of conflict. Yet identity is not necessarily given. Rather, it is socially constructed and can change over time. Historically, elites have played a crucial role in shaping and instrumentalizing identity and in determining how and why identity becomes salient and politicized. As we looked at these three factors, state capacity, business, and identity, and we explored how internal dynamics of elite bargains can change, we found that, not surprisingly, institutions, both formal and informal, play a crucial role. Institutions not only reflect, but also shape interactions between elites, and they define the parameters for how those outside a bargain can seek to challenge it and to redefine the underlying rules of the game. Let me use identity as a way of illustration. A central question related to pathways towards more inclusive politics relates to the extent to which states and societies can foster ties of trust and reciprocity within and between each other that are multiple and overlapping, rather than based on narrow, simplified, and binary identities. As Dominic mentioned earlier, different institutional arrangements, ranging from power sharing arrangements, political party and electoral systems, to decentralization, mechanisms of electoral representation such as quotas and new media, will have an impact on how identities are shaped and how narrow or cross-cutting they are or they can become. As existing research and evidence suggests, there is no one perfect institutional model or design that will always seamlessly work towards cultivating a sense of identity that can overcome narrow divides. Different institutional models and arrangements will have important advantages and drawbacks, and they will all generate tensions, dilemmas, and trade-offs. This is, in fact, a recurring theme in our research that my fellow researcher, Sarah, will also highlight shortly.
That's great, Elena. You can really see there why understanding these dynamics are absolutely crucial for what we're trying to do. Sarah, the research was commissioned by FCDO to help with its own thinking and its work. But we're hearing a lot right now about what happens at the internal country level rather than at the external level. So from the perspective of external actors seeking to support these sorts of transitions towards more open and inclusive politics, what do you think the key issues people need to be thinking about?
Thanks, Heather. I'll highlight 3 important issues here. First, as Dominic mentioned, change is driven both from outside and from within. Major external shocks constitute critical opportunities for external actors to change the nature of an elite bargain. But we would add that the impact of such shocks, as well as other more gradual forms of change, are always mediated through the internal dynamics and institutions of the elite bargain, and that these institutions, so that internal dimension, therefore constitute key access points for external actors. At the same time, it's important to note that these institutions exist in a wider regional and international context that shapes the incentives, resources, and opportunities of both political elites and the actors capable of influencing them, such as businesses. It's therefore important to keep that wider context within which elite bargains exist at the heart of analysis and policy choices. Second, our analysis suggests that change will take place gradually and that the degree of change that can realistically be expected in the short to medium term is going to be limited. So this requires adopting a long-term perspective and being really sort of willing to stick with it. And this emphasizes, again, the importance of institutions and helping to consolidate gains and make them stick. And third, most external engagement in fragile contexts is based upon government consent, and with good reason. The implementation of external interventions is usually more effective and efficient where local elites are on board and feel that their interests are represented. At the same time, this reliance on consent reduces the leverage of external actors. It can both give elites an implicit veto over particular interventions and can reduce the ability and willingness of external actors to call out certain behaviors by elites.
Thanks, Sarah. Just a quick follow-up question there. In terms of what are the key lessons do you think there are for policymakers with that, considering we've heard a lot about things like the need to think about long-term perspectives, legitimacy, and consent in the past?
So it's hard to choose here. There's a lot of lessons, but I'll highlight 2. So first, not all good things go together. There's unlikely to be a golden thread in interventions or a virtuous cycle where progress in one area supports progress in others and kicks off a series of mutually reinforcing reforms. In reality, those seeking to support evolution towards developmental peace often face very difficult trade-offs between policy objectives, as Tom mentioned previously. This tension exists for both external actors and local elites. So we emphasize the need for external actors to consider the basis on which such decisions and trade-offs are made and the importance of nuanced contextual knowledge, ongoing political economy analysis, and technical expertise in doing so. Second, there's no single or linear pathway from elite bargains to more open and inclusive politics. Important to this is the fact that early choices in the formation and institutionalization of elite settlements shape and constrain the opportunities for future external engagement, for example, through peace negotiations or post-conflict constitutional settlements. Bosnia and Iraq are both examples of this, where early choices by external actors defined and formalized the elite bargain in identity terms. In addition, pathways are also shaped by the pre-conflict and conflict political economies and the history and memory of state capacity, which matter for expectations towards the state and elites and for perceptions of legitimacy. So this in turn raises questions about sequencing and perhaps uncomfortable questions about whether intervention is always the right choice.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. Tom, coming back to you, there's a lot of challenges that have been raised here from the research. Can I ask you, going forward, how do you think FCDO is already building on and using this analysis? And what opportunities and challenges do you see for taking up some of these findings going forward?
So we're actually in the process, sort of at a strategic level, of developing a new framework for how the UK approaches conflict. So this is going to look at our impact across, a broad set of areas. So looking at upstream prevention, looking at preventing violence in periods of crisis, thinking about conflict management, and also thinking about conflict resolution. And this framework is also going to try and look at some of the shifts, some of the changes we need to make in how we operate as well. So, while there's obviously, lots more questions and lots more research that can be done, this project actually has already really been really helpful in sort of honing and framing our analysis as we set out this new strategic framework. And we're definitely going to continue to sort of draw on it as we develop the work, but also as we sort of start thinking about implementing this. I mean, there's some there's a huge amount has already been highlighted, but for me, there's some really clear steers here and some of them that have been set out today are, first of all, the centrality of institutions and state capacity, the role of identity, the need to be really patient, but aware of key moments. And then this issue of just, for donors accepting the reality of trade-offs, and also accepting, on the one hand, the limits of external influence, but also being aware of the way in which external engagement, can be instrumentalized. But there's a huge amount there, and I think what would be great is to try and keep this conversation going.
If I can just ask you a follow-up question on that. I mean, when we talk about external actors, we tend to speak as if that is one type of actor, really. And I wonder from an FCDO perspective, where there's a lot of conversations around agency and understanding what it is that we can actually do and shape. How can this research help us in those conversations around realistic approaches for external actors in not just understanding the tensions and trade-offs, but making some of the tough decisions that go with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. I mean, even thinking about, within the UK government's own system, there are multiple actors. So there is, the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, but there's also the Ministry of Defence, or there are other government actors that have an impact on some of these external shocks. So, for example, when we're thinking about economic shocks, there might be other departments that are involved in that. So, first of all, that means even within our own system, there are a range of external actors. And then beyond that, in the international environment, there are, other states, and there are especially important regional states. But one thing that I thought is really interesting about this research was the focus, for example, on business actors as well as other actors that have an influence on these dynamics. And I think that also pushes us to sort of think about that a little bit more and to be a bit more creative, perhaps, in how we approach these things. But again, across all of these, I mean, the emphasis on the sort of hard reality of shaping these elite bargains, and again, the need for patience and awareness of those key moments, I think really sort of shapes that and shapes how we think about external influence.
Thank you so much, Tom. Really, the research answers some really important questions, but the gaps that it highlights are just as important as well. And it's going to be exciting to see how the research unfolds as it goes forward, and how it is going to help external actors manage some of those tensions and trade-offs better going forward. So for that, I'd like to thank the research team, Dominic, Alina, and Sarah, and Tom for being with us today for that perspective. And thank you very much.
This wraps up this episode of the podcast series. Thank you for listening, and please check out our other podcasts. For that, and to learn more about the World Bank Group efforts in environments affected by fragility, conflict, and violence, please visit our website www.worldbank.org/FCV.